Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I am so psyched to have Andrea Levier here with me today. Andrea just completed 15 years as president of Prosperity Now and is now an executive fellow at Yale SOM at the International Center for Finance in collaboration with the Program on Social Enterprise, thinking about what's next in building equitable financial markets. Andrea is also an alum of SOM, so I'm going to start by asking her, well, first of all, thank you so much for coming and for teaching in my class, Introduction to Social Entrepreneurship, and sharing your work. So I want to start by asking you, what was the first thing you did when you left SOM? How did your journey start?
Well, thank you for inviting me and for teaching what you teach at the school. So I went to SOM with the idea that business skills would be critical to advancing social and economic justice. And I was very lucky that I had a lot of classmates that had the same aspirations. And while I was at SOM, it was very clear to me that the skill that was scarcest for people who were interested in the kind of work I wanted to do was finance.
I know that's true from myself.
Yes. So what I decided to do was to get my first job in finance, but I knew myself pretty well, and I knew I couldn't be in a real corporate environment. So I was very lucky that a visiting professor who actually lived in Washington, which is where I wanted to live, told me about a national nonprofit that helped to finance economic development projects.
Okay.
And it was really like a public sector investment banker. And they worked with cities and states all over the country, structuring finance for inner city development, affordable housing, and small business finance.
Structuring public financing.
Public and private.
Okay.
So they were very, very focused on how do we leverage public sector incentives and match them to bring the private sector in to make these investments.
Interesting.
So it was a perfect model for SOM education.
Yeah. And so how did you go from there to Prosperity Now? Tell us a little bit about Prosperity Now.
So Prosperity Now is a national nonprofit with a real mission of addressing wealth inequality. Of course, when it was founded 40 years ago, we didn't know that that's what we were doing. We were thinking about how do we create on-ramps into the economy for low-income people.
Okay.
And two things led me to move there. The first is that after 9 years of doing transactions, I decided that if you didn't marry those transactions with policy, you weren't really going to make change. And the second thing was I was on the road 3 or 4 days every week, and I had 2 children under 3. And so I wanted a job that gave me more flexibility and time at home. And so when I joined Prosperity Now, it was a relatively small shop of about 15 staff and maybe revenues of $2 million. And over the 27 years I was there, we grew to $15 million and 85 staff.
Wow.
And multiple initiatives and networks.
So I'm really interested to hear about your experience there in terms of taking this financing stream forward. How did you apply your newfound knowledge into the mission of reducing inequalities? What were the main gaps you faced that are now informing the questions you're asking here?
So there's 2 ways that I looked at this. So in one sense, we were very focused on what resources and capacities do low-income people need to become financially stable and to build wealth. And as part of that work, we were constantly testing products and services from match savings for emergencies to long-term savings to buy a home, invest in education, or start a business, and then to think about all the systems and policies that needed to be changed to make that a permanent opportunity.
Right.
Then about 4 years ago, I got a call from the head of the economics unit at the NAACP. And he said to me, Andrea.
And the NAACP is?
The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
Okay.
NAACP. He said, Andrea, I think asset building, which is what we were doing, is the most effective strategy to help to address the racial wealth gap. And I want to bring my team to Prosperity Now to do that. So that was a huge leap. And what that also did was to take an analysis that we already had around racial disparities, but put that through all the work that we did so we could really integrate that perspective into our policy and programs.
So how did you do asset building, and what does it look like to do that successfully?
So let me give you an example of one of my favorite and most accessible ideas.
Okay.
So one of the ideas that we tested was match savings for low-income people and how critical that was in a 21st century economy. When we did that with adults, we discovered that their children began doing just what their parents were doing. And we said to ourselves, what if we started much earlier? And of course, I always remembered Einstein's phrase, the most powerful force in the universe is compound interest. So we did several things. Number one, we did a national demonstration to test children's savings accounts at all different ages. We had very rigorous research to match what worked best. And we had policy efforts to try to change policy at the state and federal level for children's savings. When the demonstration finished, we launched an initiative called the Campaign for Every Kid's Future, which would have 1.4 million children with a child savings account by 2020. We're now roughly at about 800,000 kids. But the most important thing that's happened out of that is that the idea of children's savings has become linked to the idea of financial education, which as standalone is not that effective. But when you pair it with real experience, it is transformational, not just for the financial capability of both the parents and children, but for the aspirations that any child can go to college or post-secondary education.
And so your role is to test new solutions and get the evidence out there. And what's needed in order for these solutions, like the example you just gave, to become the status quo and just the national default standard way of doing things so that everyone can access them?
So what we've learned is that it's complicated because there's not one way to do it.
Yeah.
It's not just passing one policy or whatever. And so one of my favorite lessons that I learned is that every time I describe what Prosperity Now does, because we do policy work, we work with practitioners on the ground, we do applied research, everybody would say to me, that's so complicated. You know, they're so used to a simple thing. Until one day someone said, that's so complicated, but you're solving a complicated problem.
Exactly.
And so it was very appropriate that we have these steps. So our view is that it takes a whole network of practitioners that are working together and learning from each other.
Yeah.
It takes policy to facilitate, and it takes knowledge of what works. One of my goals as president was to reduce the waste of intellectual capital in the nonprofit sector, because most nonprofits have so little scarce capital, operating funds.
Yeah.
Let's tell them what works best, and then they can tailor it to their community.
Exactly. And I think that a lot of people in the social innovation community are always looking for that silver bullet in terms of this is what will solve poverty. But these are really complex, multidimensional problems which persist for that very reason, because they're complicated. And so there's never going to be one person or one organization that solves them. And it's about both the diffusion of innovation, which you were working on, and about building coalitions and collaborations and partnerships, which I think is also a huge part of what you did.
Exactly. One of the greatest lessons I saw recently was from a woman who was partnering with the San Francisco Fed to study complexity and how complexity relates to community development. And what was really wonderful about her lessons was that we're working in an ecosystem, and you need to understand that there's not going to be a linear model that solves any problem.
Exactly. It's cyclical, it's iterative. So now that you're coming out of this experience, what are the main questions that you're carrying forward with you here as an executive fellow that you're going to work on? How are these informed by your work, and what are you hoping to do next in terms of synthesizing these learnings and then disseminating them?
So all the time that I was working at the National Development Council and at Prosperity Now, I had a secret passion for nonprofit finance. And I collaborated with the Nonprofit Finance Fund on several projects and other things because I saw so clearly how nonprofits did not have access to the expertise they needed for the financial principles and strength they needed, and they didn't have the right kind of capital. So really, for the last 27 years, I've had to raise money endlessly. And out of that experience, and particularly the experience of looking at all the new money that's coming in to the nonprofit sector, I said, let's go back to my lessons at SOM. And let's go back to the fundamental rule that financial strength and financial resilience depends on how well you match sources and uses of funds. And let's see if we can raise up the need to provide more philanthropic equity and equitable finance to nonprofits and social ventures, because that's essential for them to fulfill their mission.
Okay, tell me what you mean by those two things, philanthropic equity and equity finance.
Got it. So let's say...
Or equitable finance.
Equitable finance. So a nonprofit is a business, really. It just has a different tax status.
Yeah.
And one of the things...
It does different things when it has a surplus.
Yes. And one of the things we know when we look at companies is having equity, which is flexible money that you can invest in whatever you need to, is one of the critical, not only ingredients to success. Most of the money that comes into nonprofits is highly restricted.
Right.
I always have the joke, that grant says we can only spend it on Tuesdays when the sun is shining.
Exactly.
Right? And
on that
only
budget
then
line.
if you sneeze when you use the money.
And make sure to keep the receipt.
Yes, exactly. So nonprofits, almost more than for-profit businesses, need that kind of capital, which we'll call philanthropic equity or equitable kind of enterprise finance to help them. And with that needs to go the technical services or expertise. Some of these organizations have it themselves, but others need outside help, really to understand what's your financial model. One of the lessons that I shared with my board in my last board meeting was that financial management is more art than science. Of all the things we did, because in fact, there were so many influences on the financial model of a nonprofit, from politics and who was president. Overnight, we lost a quarter of our budget from federal contracts, for example, that you have to be constantly agile and know what to look for. I was saved by having a $12 million endowment that enabled me to have the unrestricted funding I need as I transition my financial model. Most nonprofits don't have that, right?
Exactly.
Or a CFO who could do all the analysis for me so I knew exactly what I needed to raise. So that's number one. Number two are the whole host of nonprofits that have social enterprise or social ventures, including community development financial institutions. They drive much of their business with debt. Much of it is subsidized debt, some of it is not. But to get that debt, they need equity on their balance sheets too.
Right.
Otherwise, people won't lend them.
So community development financial institutions are those who give out loans to
Yes.
underserved communities.
Exactly.
Like microloans or small business loans or...
Housing, mortgages,
got it.
any kind of financial product that is not being provided in the communities that need them. And they need equity as well.
Right.
And now the industry has grown so big that the main sources of equity, which has been the CDFI fund at the U.S. Treasury, is the needs completely outstrip how much money we have. But yet, as you know, everybody wants to be investing for impact now. And in many cases, they still want to get market returns, even though we're solving problems that exist because the market doesn't work in certain places. So how do we raise up the fact that these investments are worth making, worth taking either a sacrifice on return, or worth reorienting your philanthropy to do?
So, okay, these are such good questions. So how are you going about finding the answers? What approaches are you using to experiment and innovate during your year here at Yale?
So that's where Yale has come in so handy, if I can say
Circling back home.
Yes. So I began brainstorming this with Tony Sheldon, who runs the program on social enterprise. He and I were here at Yale at the same time and have worked together over the years. And was introduced to Will Getzman at the International Center for Finance, who was very intrigued at my work. And as I say, I'm the one thing that's not like the other on his board. I'm the one nonprofit member, right? But he's very interested in this question of equity. In fact, his new book is really focused on how to build in access to equity in the capital markets. So I am gathering 25 people. I've kept it small intentionally on Friday, 2 days from now, to really look at this question of how do we move forward to build more equitable financial markets. And I've invited philanthropists. I've invited nonprofit CEOs. I've invited CDFIs. We have a set of academics from Yale. And we have investors, all who are going to look at three questions. What's the case for equitable finance? What's the state of the market? What's the supply? What's the demand? And then, what are the product and service innovations that are currently in place or being tested? And then how do we think about doing systems change? Out of that will come a proceedings document. And then I'm going to follow this up with focus groups at several other national conferences where I bring together other folks to kind of test out some of these ideas. And then I'm going to come back to the Yale Philanthropy Conference and hopefully hold one, if not more, sessions on this very question.
So that's how people can loop back and hear some of the results. And that's going to be in February 2020.
Right.
So I think the main thing I'm learning here is that there are so many barriers to tackling the social challenges that nonprofits are focusing on, such as poverty reduction and elimination. And it's not just the technical challenges and the characteristics of those really complex problems, but it's also that nonprofits are not well equipped with financial equity and with skills to tailor financial vehicles and build that equity. So it's both about building programmatic evidence on how to tackle poverty, and it's about building evidence on how can nonprofits be stronger financially, both in the skills and in the actual capital flow. So you're making us look at the nonprofit world in a whole new light.
Well, there's many people who are doing this as well, the Nonprofit Finance Fund and several other philanthropists. But I think leveraging a business school to help think through this, particularly a business school that attracts students who want to do this same kind of work and want to marry these things.
Yeah, and there's this huge influx of activity around philanthropy, impact investing. I think there was a recent merger between the Student Group for Socially Responsible Investing and Impact Investing.
Oh, really?
Which is really reflective of the convergence that I think is taking place in the capital market.
That's terrific.
Thank you so much for being here with us, Andrea, this year, and for joining my class and joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for this opportunity.